The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining Sage's webinar, Protecting Small Business in a Post-Pandemic World. We are excited to have you join us today as we look at some of the ways that cyber criminals are targeting small businesses and steps you can take to be better protected. Today's speakers are Al Pascal and Kellen Burns, both with Santique, a TransUnion company. Al is the SVP of Enterprise Risk Solutions and has vast experience in data breach intelligence and fighting against fraudsters. Kellen is the VP of Financial Partnerships and has years of experience in customer cybersecurity and fraud solutions. If you happen to have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to enter them in the chat. And at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Al and Kellen.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and thank you everyone for joining us. Today, Al and I are going to cover three main topics. Number one, how the pandemic affected cybercrime. Number two, the implications for post-pandemic business fraud and security threats, and the 5 ways that businesses can stay better protected. As Sandy mentioned, please feel free to put in any questions that you have, and Al and I will make sure that we address them. Okay, so how the pandemic affected cybercrimes. First topic. First of all, it's important to start by recognizing the larger systemic changes that were created by the pandemic. The pandemic drove a change in consumer behavior away from physical storefronts and up to online transactions, which created an immensely challenging business environment for small businesses. A couple of key statistics. The pandemic contributed to an increase of $219 billion in e-commerce activity from 2020 to 2021. Number two, nearly 1/3 of small businesses closed or ceased operating because of the pandemic. And number three, as evidenced by employment data, where the retail sector lost 800,000 jobs, 4 times that seen between 2017 and 2019, delivery and warehousing businesses gained 300,000 jobs during that same period. So these are 3 monumental shifts that heavily impacted small businesses and how they served their customers. However, small businesses and consumers weren't the only ones whose behavior shifted, and Al is going to touch on some of the more negative pandemic-related shifts.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kellen. So to Kellen's point, I mean, it wasn't just you and I who didn't want to go into the store any longer. It was criminals too, right? They changed their behavior. So instead of targeting brick and mortar locations, they started targeting e-commerce merchants and conducting benefits fraud. I mean, things they can do remotely, and that was a huge boon for them. So again, coming back to the stats, e-commerce fraud, we also call it CMP fraud, jumped from 5.5 billion in 2019 up to 8.5 billion by the end of the year, but a far bigger number, totally dwarfing e-commerce fraud losses, are losses associated with the benefits that the government extended, as a result of the pandemic. Criminals stole, or ostensibly stole, up to $163 billion from unemployment programs around the country. They learned a lot doing it. We'll talk about ultimately what that means for everyone on the line today. But the fact of the matter is, yes, legitimate consumers changed the way they behaved, which affected small businesses, but so did criminals. So on the next slide, we'll take a closer look at this too, because I think there's an important point to be made around benefits fraud. So when we look at benefits fraud, it's not just the unemployment piece that we want to focus on. I think for the sake of this audience, it's really important for us to look at other areas where criminals were misusing information, because this is going to be critical when we start thinking about what businesses need to be worried about today. When we look at what happened during the pandemic, criminals also stole about $84 billion from other government programs, including EIDL and the Paycheck Protection Program. Now, these were programs designed to support businesses, ultimately, that had lost business, lost customers, were having a tough time because of the pandemic. And part of the way that criminals did that is they took legitimate information on businesses, on small businesses, potentially even your businesses, and they applied for these programs. And this is, I have to say, my own experience, we didn't talk a lot about it in the intro, but I've been in the fraud space for nearly 20 years. Between the data on the last slide and this slide, these are the largest fraud loss events that I know of ever occurring. And a lot of this involved criminals stealing information on businesses and misusing them, right? And that's very, very meaningful when we start thinking about what's happening now and what's going to continue to happen post-pandemic. But I think the good times here are coming to an end, right? Because when you lose hundreds of billions of dollars, someone's going to notice. And legislators were noticing, right? Because the media noticed, because you and I heard about it. And so the legislators demanded answers, right? And government agencies began tightening controls. And these programs where criminals were stealing tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, these programs began to shut down, right? So I think in May of last year, the Department of Justice stood up the COVID-19 task force, right, to go after fraud. A year ago, PPP ended, right? It ran out of money. And just about a month ago, EIDL ran out of money. So unless all those criminals, and let's be frank, it wasn't just old fraudsters who got involved here. It was a whole new legion of fraudsters who were trained, right, who came up on benefits fraud. Unless they all decided to go back to work, then they're going to have to do something, right? So this is all drying up, this almost seemingly never-ending well of money that they were stealing. It is drying up, it has dried up. And so, that ultimately means that things are changing, right? Things were going to change as a result. And that's going to be very, very meaningful, again, for our attendees. So let's move ahead and talk a little bit about what this means for the future, right? And basically where we are today. One more slide. And I think the best place, from my perspective, is to kind of start at the beginning. And it all starts with the data. So if you think about it, when criminals commit fraud, the way that they're going to be successful, is by starting with the information they're going to need to do things like apply for loans in the name of your business, right? To open up new accounts, to get access to your accounts, they have to have that information. It could be the name and address of your business, your EIN, phone number for a principal of the business, all those data points that they can misuse to go on and commit, all the types of fraud we talked about and new types of fraud. So they got to have that information, right? Not just to, and it's meaningful because it's not just, to rip off other agencies, to rip off financial institutions, to imitate you, but we also need to talk about where they're going to get that data. The next slide. Criminals go to places like the dark web. I know, you probably heard a lot about the dark web up to this point, right? It is those tucked away corners of the internet you can't reach with a regular browser. You have to use something like Tor to access. There are also specialized forums and channels and places like Telegram where criminals are buying and selling information. And the fact of the matter is, though, despite criminals being very familiar with where to get this information, and despite the fact that data breaches and the theft of data are not new, it's not as though that information is always available to them, and it's not as though all information has been stolen. And if you look very closely at what's been happening, law enforcement has not been sitting on its hands. And the FBI, Secret Service, they are out there shutting down these sites where criminals are buying this data. And this is just some examples of recent activity. There's some another newer one around social security number data. Actually, I just saw the other day that got shut down. As these sites get shut down, or the data deprecates, you think about card numbers, right? Card numbers expire. But as that data no longer becomes available, the fact of the matter is, they need more data, right? So the criminals who are responsible for stealing that information, there's going to be a lot of demand for what they do. They're going to be out there trying to find new sources of information to feed the fraudsters. So it's very, very important, again, to kind of keep these driving factors in mind when we start to consider the consequences ultimately for the businesses that are on the line today. Kellen?
Yeah, thanks, Al. And the unfortunate truth is the target is on small businesses' backs. So, small businesses often don't have all of the functions in place to be able to protect themselves, yet they have a lot of valuable data out there. And as the small businesses shifted their business practices online and entrepreneurship skyrocketed, a treasure trove of data became available for cyber criminals to target. So just for example, there was a 5.4 million business applications in 2021 compared to that of 3.5 million in 2019. So business applications equals valuable business data equals valuable information for cyber criminals. Small businesses were forced to adapt with 10% or more utilizing e-commerce later in the pandemic to accommodate consumer shopping preferences. So as they move their businesses practices online, obviously more data is online and available to the cyber criminals as well. And last but not least, almost 4 in 10 small business owners say they are concerned about that their business will be the victim of a cyber attack within the next 12 months. Al's going to share some statistics around why the concerns of those small businesses are unfortunately valid ones.
Absolutely, Kellen. And I think it's fair to say if I took a show of hands and asked the attendees who went into business to become a cybersecurity expert, I think the number of hands raised would be very small, right? But I can't see all of you. And we have, again, millions of new entrepreneurs in the mix now as a result, and there's a lot of opportunity for criminals to get access to that information. And absolutely be assured they are coming for that data because they need that information. And one of the areas where they're going to go to get it, right? And it's interesting when you think about it, right? It's to people. We're talking about data, we're talking about things that are digital, but the fact of the matter is that people are low-hanging fruit, right? First and last line of defense. Your employees, even the vendors who work with you, you are going to be doing things. You're going to have access to systems. You're going to make decisions about, password reuse, for example, that could be putting, your business at risk. And there's a report that comes out every year from Verizon where they look at the causes of data breaches. And you can see the stat right here on the screen, but 85% of data breaches are caused by the human element, right? So it's phishing, it's stolen credentials, it's human error. So if we start thinking about, and we'll talk more about recommendations in a little while, but if we start thinking about what are the places in your business, right, where the criminal is going to target, right, where you need to be ever vigilant, is really going to be around the things that you and your employees and vendors do around security. That's the first place they're looking for that weakness and where they're going to go to get that data. Now, once they have the data, then the question becomes, what do they do with it? All right, so if we move to the next slide, fraudsters are opportunistic, and I say that because even old types of fraud are attractive to criminals. We don't always think about that. We're talking about cybercrime, and we're thinking about data breaches, right, and everything going digital. But it doesn't mean that criminals are not going to look for opportunities to take the data they've stolen, right, the data they've gained access to, which could include your bank account routing, an account number, right? The name, information on your business, right? The identifier information on your account, and take that information and commit just old-fashioned check fraud. And if we look at the dark web, data from stolen checks, right? That data, that availability has tripled over the last few months. And it's crazy. I mean, checks have been around forever, but now check fraud is starting to bubble back to the top as a preferred kind of crime, for these criminals, right? It's almost in some ways, kind of mind-boggling, but in other ways, it makes a lot of sense.
Al, can you tell us why this might be happening, especially considering how few people are using paper checks?
Yeah, and again, just kind of going back to my own history, I worked in check fraud for a while, and even when I worked in check fraud, which was again quite a while ago, the volume of check activity, and I think anyone who has a physical channel business can attest. I mean, the volume of checks that you're seeing in store has been declining. It just has. It's time consuming. There are so many different ways to pay, and and no one wants to stand behind that person who's writing a check. But that being said, the volume of check fraud continued to increase year over year, and the only thing that really slowed it down was COVID, because no one wanted to go into the store, right, and make any kind of purchases, using a check or otherwise, and that includes the criminal. But now that physical locations have opened up, and there are plenty of places to cash checks, so it's not just going to the bank, but to regular check cashing businesses, to large mega marts that cash checks. There's just a ton of infrastructure in place for criminals to take that information, go ahead and misuse it, get those checks cashed. I mean, they're even doing things that, and it's one of the really sad parts of this whole story here. They're even going after postal employees. There was literally just a news article this morning out of the San Francisco Bay Area where a postal employee was pistol whipped, and they took the keys from the employee, to get access to the blue boxes because they're stealing checks, right? So unfortunately, because they can't do it, they do it. It's just really what it comes down to, Kellen. So let's move on to the next slide. It's not just going to be old school types of fraud that they're going to commit. They're going to take what they learned. Now, we don't need to back up the slides per se, but if we go back to some of those earlier slides, we talked about benefits fraud. Now, if you think about the way benefits fraud is committed, criminals are going to take identifying information, right? So name of the business, location of the business, EIN, financials, whether real or fictitious, and use that information to get loans, right? In the case of government benefits fraud, right, or grants that were forgiven. That process of stealing that information or gaining access to that information, right? Having that information packaged and at the ready, going online, applying to get access to those programs, to get those funds, right? Having accounts where those funds can ultimately be sent. They could be mule accounts, they could be accounts that they own, right? That whole process, that whole learning that criminals took, including a whole new generation of fraudsters, can be applied to other types of products, right, or other types of services. So think, commercial loans, lines of credit. So now, we have like a whole new swath of fraudsters, including the old ones, who have all been very well trained and have had a tremendous success in a particular process that they can scale to other types of crime. And so, that gives us another area to really pay attention to when it comes to the types of fraud that we should expect to see. And that's why we started by looking back first, right? Because that's going to give us a good indication of what to expect now from criminals who have had all this training, that understand, what data they need, they understand how to use it, they understand how to get paid. And it's the kind of thing that could involve, business information, and it has before. So that, next slide. There are other things to look out for. And so it's not just old school fraud, it's not just application fraud. There are things that you could be looking for, or you could see come across your desk, quote unquote, virtually, where criminals will take access to maybe the vendors who serve you, maybe access to your businesses or one of your employees' email accounts, or even using a spoofed account, and use that to masquerade as someone in a trusted position. And there's a couple different flavors of this, right? So, to the point, there's what we call vendor impersonation fraud, where the criminal will, a little bit more detail on kind of how this works, right, beyond what's just on the slide. Criminals can find out who you do business with. And one of the ways that they can do that is to look for like an announcement. Very often, I mean, we like to tout our own business successes. And if you work in the B2B space in particular, you like to call out, your new wins, right? I just got a new account with, ABC Corp, right? We're all so excited to be working together. Maybe it's not a press release, maybe it's just up on your site, right, under clients. But criminals, they go out and they look for that information. And once they know who you're doing business with, then they know who to target, they know who to impersonate. And so they can go after, those vendors, try to gain access to their accounts, to their email accounts, so they can imitate, your vendor, or they can go to a site where they can spoof that email address, right? And you're going to get, or someone in your finance department is going to get an email from that vendor saying, hey, the payment we're expecting at the end of the month, we've opened up a new account, right? Please the direct payment to, or the disbursement to this account. It'll look like it comes from the legitimate vendor, right? It may even come from a name right, from that vendor. It'll come across very professionally. It may include some good points of reference. So maybe there's an outstanding invoice, right? That'll get referenced in that email because they're watching those emails. They're trying to understand the kind of business you're doing. Once they have access to that vendor, then they have an entire history as well. A spin on that is not targeting your vendors per se, but instead targeting someone within your organization. So they may go to your website and you may have a list of your staff, right? The About Us, the company executives, for example. Maybe you have your CFO listed, right? Or your CEO. With that information, now criminals are going to know who to target. They may try to get access to that individual's email account. Or again, they may spoof that email account. And then an email comes across someone in accounting or finance's desk, right? Through their email, and says, hey, the new vendor we onboarded from China needs payment, early if we're expecting to get, those parts in time. Please direct payment to, again, such and such an account, right? Call me if you have any questions. It may include, again, very believable references. Maybe you just started a relationship with a vendor or supplier in China. The name may match, a lot of the details may match, and it may come across as very convincing. Criminals will target from the outside as far away as possible with something like check fraud or application fraud, but they're not afraid to get very close and personal to your business, to understand your business, to imitate people that you trust. It's just a con, right? To imitate people you trust and take advantage of that trust in order to have payments dispersed. So it's another thing to be looking out for. And this is why the human element is so important, because at the end of the day, it's you or your employees who are reading these emails and are ultimately going to make a decision as to whether or not they do things like verify those emails, whether or not they make those disbursements. So this is just another, type of fraud to be paying very close attention to. And I, again, saw another piece the other day that was written, saying, hey, this old type of crime, cybercrime, old type of fraud, it's going away. We're seeing business email compromise surge. And there's some great data out of the FBI, as far as, how losses look for business email compromise. And this is only going to get, more significant and more meaningful, as criminals get better and better at targeting, businesses. And the next slide. The last piece, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address this as well in the conversation. It's not just fraud, right? It's not just stealing your data. Sometimes criminals want the 2-for-1, and that's really what ransomware is at the end of the day. The ransomware is another thing that hasn't gone away. It actually has slowed down a little bit, and I will freely admit that the war in Ukraine has, interestingly enough, slowed this activity a bit, right? Not to say it went away, not to say it declined by some really meaningful number, but a lot of hackers that are responsible for ransomware attacks, ransomware gangs, are actually located out of Russia, and they're kind of busy. But there are a number of gangs located elsewhere, including in other parts of Eastern Europe and Asia, that are staying very, very busy. And the ransomware doesn't just target large businesses. In fact, more often than not, ransomware attacks are oriented towards medium and small businesses. And when you look at how much those payments end up being, $500,000, very few businesses can afford to easily absorb a $500,000 loss. And so, this could come in any number of ways. It could come through phishing, it could come through malware. So, they're definitely going to be targeting the human element here, as well. This may include them putting out public announcements on their sites. There are a number of sites that these ransomware groups have where they talk about the data they've stolen and who's been affected. It's a way of kind of shaming an organization into paying. And even if you pay, you may not even get the data back. And so this is an area where businesses need to have a lot of vigilance, and follow best practices, because again, it's not just large organizations that are going to be affected. The impact can be very, very significant, right? Because at the end of the day, they just want to get paid. They're indiscriminate. If they're going to target critical infrastructure, right? If they're willing to shut down gas pumps around the country, right, or poison water supplies, you can rest assured that they have no qualms about taking your money as well. So, Kellen, I think at this point we're going to get into a poll question, and I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because there's a lot of good stuff we can do to stay better protected. But let's close this section out with the poll.
Thanks, Al. Yep. So we want to hear from you guys specifically, and get your feedback on what you're most concerned about. So the poll is open right now. Feel free to put your answers in there. But which of the following are you most concerned about? 1, criminal impersonation of your business to open new financial accounts. 2, government benefits or loans fraudulently obtained on your behalf or the behalf of your business. 3, misusing your business account information to issue unauthorized payments. 4, social engineering of employees to encourage them to issue fraudulent payments. Or 5, the compromise of business systems to steal data and or demand ransom. So we'll give you guys a minute to put your answers into the poll. And throughout the rest of this webinar, we'll address specific recommendations to address these concerns. So but just want to hear from you guys and what you're most concerned about.
Thanks, Kellen. Let's give everyone 30 seconds to click through the responses here.
Okay.
And I appreciate you walking everyone through all of these. And I always feel kind of bad, having worked in the space for so long, and we try so hard to keep people protected, right? Keep businesses protected, or just go after the bad guys. When something does happen, but generally it's a serious business. We're talking about one of the largest industries there is, which is crime, and they don't go about it in nice ways. They're only out for themselves, and I think the clearer we are and more honest we are about that, the better equipped we can be, right, to make sure that we're not victims. We don't have to be victims. So I think it is important to be, transparent.
Yep, I agree. And hopefully today you guys will get a lot of, valuable information to be able to, know what to do when something like this comes up, or even in preparation of.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Alan, Kellen, it looks like we have most folks who have voted, and the results are very close, but The largest concern was the compromise of business systems to steal data and demand ransom, followed by misusing your business account to issue unauthorized payment.
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah,
Well,
and that's very, very helpful. So, when we get into the recommendations, we can maybe talk up some areas for the folks, Kellen.
yep, which is appropriate because we're going to talk about, the 5 steps for staying safe in a post-pandemic world.
Perfect. All right. I think I'm going to take this one and pass off to Kellen after. But first things first, and I think this goes to it was the third poll option around criminals misusing your existing accounts. And so this is something, actually 3 things that every business can do to keep those accounts better protected, right? So let's raise the walls around those accounts. Let's make it harder for them, as well as let's be in a better position to detect when something go wrong, right? And so I'm actually going to start from right to left. So if we go far right, positive pay. And positive pay is, if you don't use positive pay, then all it really is a file that says these are the checks that I've issued, right? And the ACH payments that I am making or expect to make. And that's something that is provided to your financial institution so that when checks do come in, when ACH payments are about to be originated, the bank can reference that file to know that those are authorized checks. Those are authorized ACH payments. And so in that way, if a criminal gets access to, your account information and tries to, basically issue their own check, or if they get a check. And so one of the ways that you can remove ink from a check is with brake fluid. Now, the bar is not very high. So let's say they get access to a check in the mail, and they remove the ink, and then they try to make it for a new amount and address it to someone else. Well, that's the kind of thing that will come up when the bank looks at positive pay, right? So they're going to know what checks were supposed to be issued. They're going to know what ACH payments were supposed to be going out. So a criminal gains access to your account information, in digital channel, tries to get into your account and initiate a payment. They're going to see that is not an authorized payment. So this is almost like a first line of defense in a way, right? You're recruiting the bank to help you better protect your financials. The second thing, everyone should be doing, right? Assuming that you have more than one person who's in a position to authorize a transaction, is set up dual authorization for wire payments. Now you can set a certain threshold for those. I think that's really up to a level of kind of comfort and how you choose to manage risk. But wires should not be going out with a single sign off. And that's very, very meaningful because any one of your employees could be compromised. And I don't mean that as a person. Yes, one person could be manipulated through social engineering, but criminals could also imitate an employee, gain access to an account digitally. And if there's not a second sign off required on a wire, then that payment's gone. And if that wire is out, especially if it's international, the odds of getting it back are negligible, right? So having 2 eyes, right, 2 sets of agreement on a wire is definitely a best practice. Now, all that being said, and this is the one thing that I think is also incumbent on us to put out there, right, if we try to be transparent, is that there is no perfect security. There is no 100% stopping everything. Your bank is going to work very, very hard to protect your account. They want to keep your business. They want to keep you safe. You're going to take steps like these, hopefully, right, and more to follow, that'll keep your accounts better protected. But criminals are very, very crafty. And so not only do you want to raise the walls very high, if they just happen to have a taller ladder, well, you also want to know if they got over the wall. And so in order to do that, you can go into your accounts, set up alerts, and you can look for or be notified of when certain types of transactions or activity on the account occur. All right. So not only have you made your accounts a harder target, you also made it so that you have more of an opportunity to detect when something is happening. And what we've seen, historically, is that the sooner something detected, right, the lower the average loss tends to be. And sometimes there's an opportunity to stop payments from going out, right? Or stop those funds from reaching the bad guy. And maybe things can be reversed or stopped on the way if you catch it early. Or maybe you stop the first transaction, you don't stop the first transaction, but you stop the next 5 attempts. So there's a lot of virtue in detection, as well as prevention. And these are 3 steps, you could be taking right away to get those accounts more secure. Kellen?
Thanks, Al. So speaking of, number 2 recommendation is to strengthen authentication. Make it harder for criminals to get access to you. Access to business systems, which was, I believe, the number 1 threat that you guys were concerned about, is a pivotal step in a criminal's efforts to gain access to your valuable information, your company, employee, and customer data. So make it harder for them to succeed. You can make it harder by making stolen credentials harder to misuse. And here, this graphic here shows a couple ways to do that. So strengthening your online credentials, use a VPN when you're out in public. If you're at the Starbucks and you need to access customer information or business information, use a VPN, use a virtual private network. Don't access unsecured Wi-Fi connections. Use the password manager. So, not only use strong passwords that's not easy to guess, but use a password manager so that you can remember specific passwords for different business systems. The good news is you can access these and many other tools directly in your Sage Security dashboard, Sage Security Shield dashboard. So all of these resources are available to you right now. Number 3, step 3, maybe the most important, is be vigilant and educate your employees. Like we mentioned earlier, employees are the first and last line of defense, and human negligence is one of the most common ways for fraud to occur. So when it comes to protecting your data and preventing fraud, employees are your first and last line of defense. Education is a critical part of raising awareness of best practices and how to spot trouble. So use the educational materials found within the Sage Security Dashboard and other valid online resources to help minimize that negligence and help your employees stay on top of cyber threats. Number 4, look for the warning signs. So like Al just mentioned, the sooner a security or fraud event can be detected, the lesser potential impact on the business. And that means keeping an eye out on your data and how your business's identity is being used. So 2 different ways to monitor this: monitor the dark web and monitor your business credit. These are both within your Sage Security Shield dashboard. So monitor your dark web, simply enter the credentials that you want monitored, all the business credentials you want monitored, and we will automatically do it. So we will be in the background monitoring for all your business components, and you'll receive an alert anytime anything is found. Similarly with the business credit, let us help you monitor your business credit. Make sure that nobody is taking out loans on your company credit or putting different, using your company credit is a great way to be able to spot potential crime. And last, but certainly not least, step 5, turn to a trusted provider when things do happen. So as much as we want to be able to prevent and be proactive about fraud, if something happens, the good news is you have a trusted provider and experts to turn to. So, fraud and security issues can be huge distractions at best to your business or impede on your business at the worst. So it can really help to have somebody that you can turn to and quickly guide you to restore your business identity and limiting the impact. So this is what we're here for. This is really the bread and butter of our business. And, we've been helping not only consumers and small businesses across the country and the world, but we've helped some, Sage Security Shield members as well. And, one example that I'm thinking about, and this is relevant because it is something that you guys have mentioned that you're concerned about, is payment fraud. So one Sage Security Shield member, they had a fraudster opened a payment vendor account under PayPal and Venmo under their business name. So multiple transactions were completed and funds were paid to the fraudulent account, which obviously caused financial responsibility and reputation damage to that business. So what did they do? They called into your dedicated 1-800 line for Sage Security Shield, And on behalf of that customer, we worked with the payment vendors. We worked with PayPal. We worked with Venmo. We helped dispute the fraudulent accounts and transactions. We identified the customer IP address versus the account IP address to determine the account validity. We contacted payment recipients and payers and ensured activity identified as fraud was not related to the business. And we helped the customer review valid payment vendor accounts for suspicious activity, and updating their account security and getting them back to pre-event status so that they were not left in the dust and, you know, forced to either shut down their payments accounts and, you know, lose that money for good. So that's something that we helped a existing Sage Security Shield member on, as well as many other, you know, real live case studies and examples. That's a dedicated line. You'll deal with the same person and kind of a case manager to help you with any issue, big or small. So make sure you guys utilize it. It's at your disposal. Al? Oh, actually, you know what? I will just, if you don't have anything else to add, you can just wrap it up. I want to make sure that you guys know that you know, a lot of the things we mentioned today are scary, but it's manageable. So, and thanks to Sage Security Shield, you have these tools at your disposal. Activate your account today and start taking advantage of them. You can take advantage of all of the different tools, some of them, or, you know, however you want to utilize the service, but it's free to you. It's provided by Sage. And we want to make sure you guys are taking advantage of it. If there's any questions that you guys have, please do not feel free, or please feel free to reach out to me, kburns@sontic.com. I will help make sure that any questions you have about anything we talked about today will get answered, or I'll at least be able to direct you to the right person. So please feel free to reach out if needed. And last but not least, if you guys have any questions that you put through the chat during this webinar, or even, you know, if you want to put some in the chat function right now, Al and I are happy to address anything that we can.
Yeah, Kellen, it looks like we're a little tight on time at this point, but there was one question that came in that I want to make sure we address, and it was on positive pay. And the question was, you know, whether or not all banks are able to work with positive pay. Actually, the answer is no. Not all banks, all commercial banks offer positive pay. You know, so that's something you'd have to, you know, go to your bank to confirm. And you know, some offer positive pay for checks, but not for ACH. Right, so that's another qualifier. But in order to know best, we do recommend that you go right to the bank that you work with to see what they offer. But it is not ubiquitous. Most banks, but not all. I think, you know, with that, Kellen, if there are other questions, I think the team here, again, given the time, we'll be happy to take those offline. We'll make sure we respond to every question that comes in, and, you know, get those all answered for the attendees today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining Al and I, and we'll look forward to getting your questions answered.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.